Well, good afternoon from Cheshire. Glad to see there's lots of people interested in Andrena mining bees, which is sort of say they're just about to emerge round about now. So hopefully this today will give you a bit of either a refresher or a decent introduction to the family of what you're likely to see in the next few months or so. The talk's roughly in two halves. We've got the first part will be an introduction to the ecology and behaviour of the bees, and then we'll look at some examples of species found in the northwest of England. I've concentrated on that region because that's the one I know best, but I suspect most people will be familiar with the species we're looking at. I think worldwide there are about 13 to 1500 species of Andrena. They're largely sort of found in the Holarctic regions, although some are found in tropical Africa and places like northern India and Pakistan. In the UK, we've got 70 species, all of the family Andrenidae, of which 67 are Andrena and 2 are Panurgus. They're the shaggy bees, which are mainly found down south, so we can happily ignore those. And there's one Andrena agilissima, which is found only in the Channel Islands. Size of the bees varies. Some are really small, what we so-called mini miners, which can be about 6 or 7 millimeters long. So those are about the size of a honeybee or even larger. Most generally have a black integument, which is basically the colour of the chitinous skeleton, although some have sort of various markings. You might have red marks on the abdomens, and some have sort of yellowish marks on the thorax as well. Most have dense fur up among parts of the body, usually on the thorax, but also on parts of the abdomen and face as well, whereas others are quite bald looking. Most of them sort of are strongly banded, especially sort of things like Andrena flavipes, and several have flecking or patches on the abdomens, often with white hairs on the sides of some of the tergites, such as Andrena dorsata and Wilkella. And a number have got a patch of golden hairs or white hair or sort of brownish hairs at the tip of the abdomen, which all of these can be useful to identify them. Andrena species are broadly similar to the genera Melita and Colites, but the main feature you're looking at is this area here of what's called facial fovae, which is an area in the inner eye margins, which have got, it's basically like a patch of velvet on the skin, on the head of the bee. Obviously you need a decent hand lens or microscope to see this, but that's probably one of the main features you need to look for. Females have probably the most extensive pollen collecting apparatus than almost any of the other bees. The entire section of the hind leg is devoted to sort of collecting pollen, as well as parts of the propodium, which is just the tip of the thorax round about here. The hairs are completely covered with the legs are completely covered with branch hairs, which give a greater surface area to collect pollen. And there are short curved hairs at the top of the leg and just at the base of the propodium. This is usually referred to as a floccus in the text. Most species, the hairs are branched, but some that collect large pollen, usually from plants like scabious, the hairs tend to be feathery. Unlike social bees, like honeybees and bumblebees, the pollen is not mixed with nectar when it's carried by the bee back to its nest. The pollen's actually collected and transported dry. The main advantage of this is it's more likely to be transported from one flower to the next, which means Andrena are particularly efficient pollinators, especially of sort of spring flowering shrubs and fruit crops. So it's also worth looking out for the antennae. The tips of Andrena are blunted, unlike Melita species. Sorry, are pointed, whereas those in Melita species are quite blunt. To tell them from Colites, the easiest way is to look at the wing venation. You will find, sort of, if you look in any of the textbooks, field guides or whatever, there's quite a quite a range of technical terms which you'll come across when they're used to identify or describe different parts of the bee structure. These are just the main ones we're likely to come across in this presentation. So you've got the clypeus, which is basically the part of the face below the antennae, which the colour of which can vary within different species, and also it can be hairy, it can be sort of quite bold. The gallae, which are these areas here, which are either side of the tongue. The tongue in sort of Andrena mining bees is pretty short and it's also pointed, but that's probably not a feature you're likely to see unless you're using a microscope or looking at sort of a preserved specimen. The propodium is the region at the rear of the thorax. It's actually the first abdominal segment, but it's separated from the abdomen itself by the sort of the waist. So that's often referred to, especially when you're looking at the pollen collecting apparatus and also the sort of colour of the hairs on these species. The tergites, which are regularly mentioned in the text, they're the dorsal plates of the abdominal segments. They're generally sort of 6 in a female and 7 in a male. So that's quite useful when you're coming to identify and use the keys, as a lot of the time if you're using certain references, they'll separate male and keys of male and female bees. These are actually numbered. So you start off here as tergite 1, and this will be at the end, it'll be tergite 7. The sternites, which can also have sort of useful identification features, are actually the ventral parts of the abdominal segments. You'll also, a lot of the descriptions you'll come across will mention parts of the legs of the bees. The tibia is sort of this bit here, just in the center of the leg, and the femur is more towards the top of the leg. These can be, again, quite useful identification species when you're working with some specimens. As we say, Andrena species are all solitary, but they can nest in large aggregations, and the latter can sometimes number thousands of nests in sort of densely arranged cities, if you like. And some of them, like Bucephala and Ferox, you get females using a common nest entrance, which can give the impression of some sort of social behaviour. Some of these aggregations, especially amongst Andrena ferox, can be quite large. In one instance, there's over 1,000 females were counted using the same entrance. Such nests can be actually perennial, so they can be used for sort of several years by different generations of bees. The internal structure is similar in most species. There's an entrance connected to a long tunnel from which lateral cells arise, and these terminate in a cell or cluster of cells in which the egg's laid and it's provisioned with nectar and pollen. The cells themselves are actually lined with a secretion from the bee probably to make them waterproof and have sort of antibacterial properties as well. You can usually tell solitary bee nests from above because they usually have these sort of piles of earth around the entrance. Most species, when they leave the nest, will actually sort of seal it. They'll just sort of cover the entrance with a bit of sand or soil, generally basically to hide it from possible predators or parasites. As far as life cycle goes, most species are univoltine, which basically means there's just one life cycle per year, usually sort of lasting about 3 to 3.5 months. Time of the year can vary with different species. Most sort of seem to be sort of emerge March, April and continue to early or late summer. There are odd species which can have 2 life cycles per year, but they tend to be more sort of southern species. We find that the species that fly in spring overwinter as adults underground, whereas the later flying species tend to overwinter as pupae. A small number of species can as I say, are bivoltine, which means you have two different generations. The second summer brood often slightly differs from that of the spring, so just be aware of that. Males always appear before the females, and they often sort of swarm or let, usually in a sort of specific place, usually around a local shrub or tree trunk, usually often sheltered, and they'll just sort of fly around in a big swarm waiting for any females to turn up when they can. Basically, the whole sole function of the male bees is to mate with the females, and that's sort of more or less it as far as they're concerned. Most mining bees contain pollen from a variety of flowers from various families. There are a small number which concentrate on just one family, which generally referred to as oligolectic. These are the ones that feed on willow or scabious species in the UK. And we just have one species, which is what's referred to as monolectic. It only collects pollen from white bryony. Nectar can be obtained from a variety of flowers. It doesn't have to be the same one from which to collect pollen. They are short-tongued species, so they generally require open flowers such as dandelions, daisies, brambles, that kind of thing. Although the larger species can sometimes feed on more deep flowers. Parasites are an interesting topic in themselves. There are a variety of what we call kleptoparasites, which basically means bees that lay their eggs in nests of the mining bees, the so-called cuckoos, if you like. These are generally of the genre Nomada or Sphacodes. You also find at this time of year in particular, bee flies will actually appear, and they'll sort of parasitize nests. The one on the left here is one of the example of one of the nomad or wasp bees, as they sometimes name. Basically, the female of this species will enter the nest of the host species, go down as far as the egg chamber and excavate a small cavity next to where the egg's laid. And she'll lay her own egg in that cavity. And once it's hatched, which is usually a few days before that of the host, the larvae will devour the egg and all the provisions within that nest cell, and then emerge as an adult of the nomad bee. Most nomad bees in the UK are host specific, so sometimes if you can actually identify the nomad bee, you can infer the presence of the host species. Although that's not always true. There are some nomad bees which will take over the nests of several closely related Andrena species, particularly Nomada flavogutata, which enters the nests of several of the mini minor species. The bee fly is a large sort of dicteron, which is sort of gingery brown, covered with these sort of often these large patterned wings. It's about the size of a sort of small bumblebee, so it's quite obvious. And they sort of emerge late March into April. They sort of tend to lay their eggs in the vicinity of nests. And once the larvae hatches, it sort of makes its way into the nest of the host, where it eats the contents. Stylops, which is this thing here, is an interesting group of insects. The larvae are actually basically lying wait on flowers, and when the sort of bee comes to visit, they'll sort of hitch a ride back to the bees' nests. Once in the nest, they'll sort of burrow their way into the pupa, into the grub which is in the nest, and they'll sort of develop along with it. And when the bee pupa becomes an adult, the Stylops will actually emerge with it, and it'll reside in the abdomen of the bee. So you'll just get this head basically poking out from the abdomen between the sort of tergites. You can get sort of several of these in the same single individual bee. The infected bees tend to be what referred to as intersex, which basically means they have both male and female characters. They don't actually construct a nest, they just spend their time sort of visiting flowers and drinking nectar. Once the Stylops males emerge, the adults sort of fly off, and they'll actually mate with the females, which remain within the bee themselves. So when the bee sort of visits a flower, the female will just drop off into the flower and lay her eggs on the flower, and the next generation occurs. These are mainly only found in spring, so sort of not one you're likely to find in sort of later generations of Andrenas. There are also hosts for things like other beetles, and you'll also find things like canopid and other flies will sort of attack solitary bees, and they'll generally lay their egg inside the bee itself, and the sort of when the larvae hatches, it'll eat the bee from the inside. As far as identification of these species, with a bit of practice, you can identify probably between 8 or 10 British species in the field. A few others can be identified from photographs. If you are planning on photographing these sort of species, obviously try and get a decent view as possible, but also from as many angles as you can, because some of the features which we need to sort of identify them aren't always obvious. You might need to photograph the face or the tip of the abdomen, or get close-ups of the legs or whatever. So try and get as many images as you can, and also if you're going to send them to your local recorder, send as much information as to where the bee was, if it was feeding on any flowers, how big it is, what time of year. The more information you can provide, the better. Then we can sort of get a better idea of what species it was. Some can't be identified without sticking them under a microscope, unfortunately. An obvious difference between male and female bees is that males have 13 antennal segments and 7 abdominal tergites, whereas the females have 12 and 6 respectively, but they're generally more larger and more colourful amongst most bees. If you're using Steve Folt's field guide, for example, that separates, the keys are separated for males and females. So it's worth knowing what sort of sex of the bee you've got before you start. Like most bees, you will get individual variation between species. It might just be the colour of the hairs on the abdomen or thorax. It might be the size of the bee, can vary. In certain species of Andrena, we get what's called male gigantism, where you get odd males which are actually larger than the females. These often have large heads and long curved mandibles, but they generally look the same as the sort of normal males. Colour of specimens will also be affected by the age of the bee. Obviously, a bee that's been on the wing a few weeks, the hairs and colours of the hairs will fade, and the hairs will be worn away. So that can cause some confusion. And also be aware that when Andrena females are actually carrying pollen, they often give the appearance of having bright yellow hind legs, which is not really helpful for certain species. So what it might be worth doing is, if you've got a butterfly net in a pot, collect the bee, and if you line the pot with some tissue paper, that usually sort of helps remove some of the pollen, and so you get a better idea of sort of the colour of the legs on the species. One tip I was given was that get to know what a honeybee looks like, because a lot of Andrena species are similar in size to a honeybee, and the colouring can be quite similar as well. But as you can see on this image here, honeybees always carry the pollen in a ball on the hind legs, and they often fly with their sort of legs dangling down underneath them, whereas Andrenas tend to tuck their legs under the body when they're in flight. We'll go through some examples of local mining bees which we find regularly in the Lancashire and Cheshire region. The sandpit mining bee Andrena barbilabris. These are sort of widely distributed throughout the UK, but it seems to be recorded more often in sort of Cheshire in the last few years. That could be just that there's more people looking out for it, or it may be a sort of an obvious increase in the number of species. It's generally found on light sandy soils, so basically you're looking on heath and acid grasslands or coastal sites. Nesting is often in large aggregations, and the males are often seen flying very low over the nest site. Occasionally, you might see a male actually enter the nest in pursuit of a female, even one that's sort of carrying pollen and has obviously mated. They sort of feed on a wide variety of flowers, and they're on the wing sort of April to mid-June. This is one of the species which is parasitized by one of the what they call blood bees, which is a small black bee with an obvious red stripe around the abdomen. They are sort of quite difficult to identify. They're sort of one of the many specimens you need to sort of use a microscope to identify them. The female sort of has this sort of very furry thorax with sort of what they call a red-brown pile, and these sort of there's a small number of hairs roughly on the side of the face here, and the abdomen has these whitish fringes on sort of tergites 2 to 4. It can look very similar to Andrena bicolor, but the female has a sort of smaller head, and if you look at the shape of the abdomen, it's more oval shaped than bicolor. As far as FW is concerned, that's the length of the forewing. For some reason, that's the measurements in Steve Falt's field guide. So obviously the length of the bee will be slightly longer than that, but there's sort of variation between different individuals. The male looks very silvery in appearance, just this covering of long white hairs on the head thorax, and you see these sort of. Then the abdomen's quite long and narrow with these sort of white hair bands. Gwyn's mining bee is usually one of the first to emerge. It's common throughout most of England and Wales and moving slowly into Scotland. It's mainly a woodland species, but it will occur in open grassland and gardens as well. For such a common bee, there's not a lot known about the sort of nesting of this species. Basically, the nests have just not been that easy to locate, although it seems to be that they use south-facing banks and slopes, and they don't seem to be gregarious. As with most bees, they feed on forage on a variety of different plant families. This one has 2 flight periods. It's usually on the wing sort of early March and then to May, then there'll be a second cycle in July to late August. The female is quite a distinctive bee. It has this sort of reddish brown thorax. The face is covered with these sort of black hairs, and there's bands of long yellowish hairs on the abdomen, as well as this conspicuous orange bunch of hairs on the hind leg. The male is pretty nondescript. It's sort of generally sort of mainly black haired and with black hairs throughout most of the legs. Although in the summer they will have paler brown hairs on the face, but it's not sort of much to distinguish them. Often you'll find in cases like this, the presence of the female will probably be a useful pointer to identify the species. The hawthorn mining bee is sort of locally common throughout England and Wales. We have a few records in Cheshire in recent years, and although in Lancashire it seems to be sort of mainly in the north of the county and is yet to be recorded in the sort of Merseyside area. It's a species usually associated with open woodland where it nests in sort of sandy and loamy banks, although little is known about the nesting habits, but it seems to be mainly in isolated burrows. It forages on a sort of variety of spring blossoming shrubs and trees such as hawthorn, willows, that kind of thing. And it sort of has a relatively long flight period, late March to early July. It may also be found in August, which may suggest there's a sort of second brood. This is one of the species which is susceptible to being stylopized, especially sort of females which emerge early in the year. So you might find whole numbers of large numbers of this bee infected at that, with Stylops. So that's always worth looking out for if you do find it. The female is a sort of medium-sized bee. It's sort of, again, it's got a dull brown pile on the thorax, orange tibiae, and the abdomen is more or less bare apart from these white bands on high margins of the tergax, usually 2 to 4, occasionally slightly lower, and you also get these small patch of orange hairs at the tip. The male is one of several species which has got this obvious yellow clypeus with sort of 2 black spots, usually about there. Otherwise, it's sort of got orange tibiae and white hairs on the sternites, and often sort of small patches of reddish hairs on the abdomen. Ashy mining bee is one of the several species which seems to be increasing in its range in the last few years. So it's locally common throughout England and Wales, and sort of moving slowly into sort of southern Scotland. It's found in a variety of habitats, such as woodland rides, clearings, short grasslands, parks, gardens, as well as coastal cliffs and other urban surroundings. The nesting ashy mining bee can form very dense and very extensive aggregations, including some which have been counted as including 10,000 nests. The nests themselves are actually quite small. They sort of go down to a depth of about 20 centimeters and only have 2 or 3 egg cells in each one. So it's probable that a single female bee will probably excavate 5 or 6 nests within its lifetime. Unlike most other mining bees, the entrance of the nest is actually left open where the female leaves, unless the weather's actually bad or it's raining, then she'll actually seal the nest entrance up. As well, we'll be on the wing sort of mid to late March and carry on sort of into June. Its main parasite is Nemada lethburniana, but it's also a host of various bee flies, such as Bombilius discolor and Bombilius major, although this species isn't known to be sort of stylopized. The female is sort of unmistakable. It's a sort of black bee with these sort of pale white hairs on the face and black, and just at either end of the thorax, and almost entirely black abdomen. The legs on this species are also sort of entirely black as well. The male actually resembles a small, slimmer version of the female, although their hairs tend to be a lot paler. And they've also got sort of this obvious white patch of hairs on the very obvious white patch of hairs on the face. Andrena clarkella is another very common species throughout much of the UK. It's mainly found in sort of open woodlands, sandpits, heaths, moorlands, and will regularly visit gardens. It tends to nest in banks, often amongst tree roots, where they might be in large aggregations. If you do find sort of the nest sites, it's worth looking out for the males. They seem to have 2 strategies when searching for females. You'll either see them flying very low over the nesting site, looking for any females which may emerge, or they actually regularly investigate nearby tree trunks, especially if they're sort of in the sun, where they'll sort of fly up the tree trunk in a sort of zigzag pattern for a few meters, and then they'll sort of fly to the base of a nearby tree and repeat the process all over again. Basically, they're looking for any sort of females which might be resting on the trunk. They mainly feed on salix. They're one of several species which just use that as a food source. They're regularly seen sort of late early March onwards. They want one of the sort of earliest ones to emerge, and they have sort of the main parasites is a mixture of Nomadoleucophthalma and the bee fly Bombilius major. Female is quite easy to identify. It's got this very furry black pile of hairs on the abdomen and on the face, and the sort of dark reddish hairs on the thorax. The male is slightly smaller. It's about the size of a honeybee. It's quite nondescript, so they can be sort of confused with certain other species. So you usually best identify this if the sort of females are in the same location. The thorny mining bee is one which probably everybody's familiar with. It's very common throughout much of England and Wales, and it's closely associated with open sites such as grasslands, parks, and gardens. It favours level ground where it sort of nests in amongst low vegetation, often in extensive aggregations. A typical nest contains 4 to 5 cells, so on average, a female may provision 2 to 3 nests during their lifetime. They're easily identified by the sort of pile of soil or earth at the entrance, which looks like a sort of small volcano. It's one of the sort of regular inquiries we get in the museum with people finding these things in the lawns. These feed on most spring flowering shrubs, such as willows, blackthorn, hawthorn, as well as fruit trees. They're sort of on the wing, sort of normally in late March, although I have sort of heard reports of them being in Cheshire in late February this year. So obviously the sort of warm weather early on has woken a few of them up, and usually around until mid June or thereabouts. They have various parasites, including Nomadosignata and Pantheri, and also the bee fly. So if you got Andrena fulva in your garden, it's always worth looking out for the bee fly as well. It's sort of a good place to see them. Female is unmistakable. They've got these orange hairs on the abdomen and sort of reddish brown pile on the top of the thorax. The face and the legs are completely covered in black hairs. The male has a sort of rich brown pile on the thorax, but the hairs on the abdomen are a lot sparser, and they tend to be sort of more of a buffish colour. And you'll also see this obvious white patch on the face. It looks like it's got sort of a white moustache. And if you look at the mandibles of this species, you'll see they've got long mandibles with a ventral projection, which can be an important feature because there are several other species which you might find with that. So one sort of hint, if you are actually preparing specimens of these things, it's always worthwhile to make sure you've got the mandibles accessible so you can actually sort of see what the structure's like. Orange tail mining bee. It's also seen this referred to as the early mining bee. It's found throughout the UK, usually in sort of places like broadleaf woodlands, grasslands, as well as gardens. Its nesting habits aren't that well known. It tends to nest under vegetation, but it seems to nest either singly or in loose aggregations. It mainly visits sort of spring flowering shrubs, particularly fruit trees. And again, it's an early species on the wing, sort of mid-March to June. The female has this very neat brick red pile on top of the thorax with a dull black abdomen with very few hairs, but you will note this sort of patch of orange hairs at the tip. plus the whitish face and sort of yellow tibia. The male is sort of more reddish brown, and you'll notice on the tibia here, which is sort of a red brown in colour, you might just be able to make out a black mark halfway along. This is sort of only a characteristic of this species. So that's, if you can get a decent view of it, that's one good way to identify the males of this mining bee. The bilberry mining bee is widespread throughout Britain, but it tends to be sort of local in distribution. Basically, it needs areas where it's got abundant bilberry, which is the main pollen source for the females. So you'll find it on open moorland in particular, although you will get odd ones in sort of woodland clearings. It seems to nest singly or in loose aggregations, and often sort of in the vicinity of its food plant. It has a relatively short flight period, usually early April to sort of mid-June, so it's not on the wing that long. It's one we have found in small numbers in both Lancashire and Cheshire, but it's nowhere near is it common anywhere. The female has this sort of reddish brown pile on the thorax, black head and black abdomen with sort of, if you can see, these long pale hairs usually around the first 2 or 3 tergites. And you'll find there's also a patch of white hairs just towards the top of the hind leg, which you might be able to just see, but generally it is pretty obvious if the wing wasn't in the way. The male is another one of these species with long mandibles, with a sort of very long ventral projection. They've sort of got these pale brown hairs on the propidium and on the thorax, and there's also, again, the white hairs at the top of the legs, and there's also white hairs under the sternites, but they're obviously sort of not obvious when you see it from the top of the bee. The buffish mining bee is one of the larger species. It's very common throughout lowland Britain. It's found on meadows, calcareous grassland, coastal dunes, and it's also very common in urban environments. It tends to nest in bare ground or in it can use soft mortar as well in certain circumstances, and it can be in sort of very dense aggregations. It mainly feeds on sort of spring blossoming shrubs, and it has quite a long flight period from mid-March to late July. There are also sort of records of this in August, which may sort of indicate that there's a second brood in certain parts of the UK. This sort of matches as its nomad kleptoparasite, which also has known to be double brooded. It's a large bee, about the size of a honeybee, but it's generally pretty nondescript. The female has this dense pile of buff hairs on the thorax and abdomen, and also these sort of similar coloured hairs at the top of on the tibia. The male is very sort of similar to the female, but sort of has less hairs on the abdomen. And again, and also these sort of black hairs on the side of the side of the face. And also on usually also as well as the sort of lower part of the face, which you can't sort of see on this image. The grey-patched mining bee is mainly a species found in the southern and central Britain, but it has sort of been recorded more regularly in sort of our area in the last few years. It's mainly found on sort of calcareous grasslands, meadows, and cultivated parts of the country. It nests, I say, singly or in small aggregations, and feeds mainly on things like willows and blackthorn, as well as, and also on bellifers and dandelions. It's got, again, a not relatively long flight period, usually sort of late March to mid-July. The main sort of distinguishing feature on this species of these two is the patches of sort of white hairs on the sides of the thorax and also on the sides of tergites 2 and 3. These are quite obvious in the field, so they can be sort of relatively simple to identify. Otherwise, it's got this bright reddish pile on the top of the thorax with a black abdomen. The face also has a small patch of white hairs. Similarly, on the males, they've got white hairs on the face and the sort of the extensive areas of white patches along the side of the thorax and just at the top of the abdomen. The chocolate mining bee is very common throughout the UK and found in most habitats, ranging from open woodlands to coastal sites and parks and gardens. Usually nests in sort of very large aggregations, so it can nest in existing cavities such as rabbit holes and sort of holes in mortar, in soft mortar in walls. It's one of these species which may occasionally use a communal entrance. You'll get several females using the same nest entrance. It forages on a variety of blossoming shrubs, things like willows, hawthorn. It's particularly important as a pollinator of apples in early spring. It's on the wing sort of late March into early May. It has 2 host species of Nemada, and it's one of those stylopized species of bee, so early emerging specimens are worth looking out for, just to sort of see if they sort of have the accompanying parasite. It's about the size of a honeybee. Its name generally refers to the colour of the brown hairs on the abdomen, on the thorax. It's usually sort of reddish brown. The main feature to look out for on this bee is that the 2-tone appearance of the hind tibia. You'll notice it's sort of dark above and pale and white underneath. This is probably one of the few. There are several bees which have that feature, but this is probably one that's most noticeable on this species. The female, obviously, that's a feature which can cause a bit of confusion if you've got a specimen which has got a leg full of pollen, so just be aware of that. The males are one of several species which have very long antennae. If you look at segment 4, which is around about here, it's twice as long as segment 3. So that's basically a feature you will come across if you're looking at the sort of the keys and in the description in the field guides. There are 2 similar species which you might find in certain parts of the country, which basically Andrena trimerana or Andrena rosae, but these have sort of red patches usually on the sides of the tergites or the sternites. This species doesn't have that feature. There are 10 species of what are called mini miners. Basically, they're just small versions of the normal mining bees. They're very common throughout Britain, up to far as South Scotland. Unfortunately, due to their size, they're not particularly easy to identify. You need to sort of collect a specimen and sort of examine it microscopically. They're found in a sort of variety of open and wooded habitats and often nest in dry soil in large aggregations. They can be on the wing from mid-March, anytime from mid-March into September. I say we've got 3 species in our area. This is probably by far the commonest, although because of their size, they tend to be overlooked and generally under-recorded. Okay, they're just generally sort of dark grey or black species. It's basically a sort of, you will find the hind margins of some of the abdominal tergites have obvious hair fringes, but this will sort of vary within the different species. As far as the male goes, they're just sort of small black bees. The main difference is that the summer generation has sort of shinier tergites and has sort of more pale hairs on the face. But as I say, these are ones you can't really separate in the field. You'll need to sort of take specimens and examine them under a microscope. We have a variety of other species which have been recorded in Lancashire and Cheshire over the years. As far as Lancashire concerned, in this case, it refers to Lancashire North Merseyside. Unfortunately, for those in Greater Manchester, it seems to be sort of generally overlooked in local publications. So I apologise if there's any species missing from your part of the world. As you can see, Lancashire's got 30 species recorded, whereas Cheshire's got 35. Although having said that, 6 of those haven't been recorded in the county for the last 40 odd years. So basically, it seems to be sort of an even split between the two counties. Obviously, some of them are more common than others. Some, like Coetana, has only been recorded 3 times in recent years, whereas Andrena marginata, the sort of small scabious mining bee, has only been recorded once from a site near Huyton. There are sort of few species which may sort of be slowly colonising the region. We've had Andrena tibialis in the last year or so. So basically, with more recording and more people out there looking, we might sort of be able to sort of expand this list. As far as references for these species are concerned, you've got the 2 obvious ones: Steve Falk's Field Guide to the Bees of Britain and Ireland, plus the Handbook of British Bees, written by George Else and Mike Edwards. They'll give you as much information as you need on these species. Ted Benton's book on solitary bees is mainly looking at sort of their biology and behaviour, so that's a sort of useful supplement to these species. Both Lancashire and Cheshire have had recent bee atlases produced for their different counties. The Lancashire book has only been out a few weeks. That was written by Ben Hargreaves, so that's available through the Lancashire and Cheshire Fauna Society. Unfortunately, it doesn't cover Greater Manchester, which sort of seems to be a strange omission, but hopefully we might be able to sort of remedy that in the next few years. As far as Cheshire is concerned, we have the Atlas of Bees, Wasps and Ants of Cheshire was produced in 2017, and that's available to download from the local record centre website. If you use that web address, you can sort of find it on their website and download it relatively easily. The aim will be to produce an updated supplement of this in the next year or so, because we have had sort of at least half a dozen species recorded in the county since that was produced. And it's also worth looking at Steve Falk's Flickr page, because that has lots of images of bees either out in the field or under a microscope, which can be very useful if you want to confirm your identification. A few acknowledgements. Obviously, the Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society is the sort of national recording scheme which provides lots of data for mapping and sort of information available from their website. You can also sort of download various information sheets, plus a book on British bees you can sort of download from there. Record is a local biodiversity information system for the Cheshire region. They collect a lot of data for our sort of recording we do, either individually or through the Cheshire Bee Group, which has been active for the last couple of years, which hopefully in the next few months might be able to sort of get out and about and recording bees again. And also I'd like to sort of thank the entomology department at World Museum in Liverpool, which allows me access to sort of their collection of over 3,000 British Andrena species, which is a very useful resource. So it means A, I don't have to collect my own specimens, and B, it's sort of that they've been identified by local experts, so you can trust basically most of the identifications. This will be open to the public hopefully at some point. So if you need sort of to bring specimens in or come and look at the collections, just contact the sort of either Gary or Leanna or the entomology staff.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Tony. I'm sure that has been extremely useful for everybody, and you're getting lots of positive feedback coming in the chat at the moment. So yeah, that's great. We'll go into questions in just a minute. I was going to mention just on the Cheshire Bee group, Leanna and Chloe, I think, is here as well. How do people sign up to the mailing list for that, or get involved with field work for that?
So we don't have anything planned at the moment, but hopefully we'll be able to get out and do some field days for the Cheshire Bee group, maybe at the end of the summer, hopefully. I'll put a link in the chat to subscribe to the mailing list, so people will be able to hear what we're up to and how to get involved.
Thanks very much, Leanna. And also maybe we could have the links into these recent atlases from the Lancashire book that's just come out, and the Cheshire atlas from 2017. I can't believe it's been that long already, but great to know, Tony, that there's going to be some effort to refresh that in the next year or so. I think that'd be great. We saw there's just been a new bee in the last few weeks, I think, hasn't there? So yeah, that list might be getting quite a bit longer now. Okay, I think we'll go into questions now. I think the first one here is, I'm not sure I completely understand, but it's from Judy Staines, and you're very welcome to unmute yourself, Judy, if you want to say it clearer than me. I have an old butler sink and was thinking of making it into a mining bee habitat. Could someone tell me if this is practicable, and if so, how should I go about it, please? I was thinking of standing it up on a short side and somehow filling it with sand and some other mixture. How do I hold the substrate in place?
Yeah, that's about the size of it.
I suspect if you kept it at an angle in a sunny spot, then you've got a good chance of attracting these things. Unfortunately, they don't go in the standard bee hotels, which you get normally. No. So
how do I mean, I can fill it with a mix of sandy soil, but how do I actually hold that in place when I stand it up on end? Because I presume that they would prefer it vertical rather than horizontal.
Not necessarily, no. They will nest in slopes.
So if I just pop it up on a brick or two one end,
yeah, it's worth trying.
That would be enough. Okay, thank you. And just sandy soil? Yeah,
I mean, they will nest in they will nest in clay soil, but not very often. So yeah.
Yeah, we've got mostly clay here.
Yeah.
But if I put a few rocks in the bottom for drainage and then pack it with loam with a bit of sand mixed in, do you think that would be a suitable sort of attempt?
It's worth a try. I mean, in the past, I've seen what are called bee banks constructed at various sites, which is just basically piles of earth in a sunny place and just left with, as long as you keep the vegetation away, then hopefully something might take up residence.
Yeah, I've seen it suggested that you plant succulents, which don't cover much of the soil, but do perhaps hold it together a bit. But I could experiment with that. So yes, thank you very much.
I think compacting the soil is quite important.
So soak it to start with?
No, just compact it down.
Just bash it down hard. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Judy. Thanks, Bill. Okay, to a question from Brian and Helen on a similar theme. I've tried to build an artificial bee bank, which is south-facing, but it has not been successful. What advice can you give on this?
No. It's a good question. It's sort of not something that I've got a lot of experience of, to be honest. But
have patience.
I mean, perhaps if you can sort of make a few holes in it and encourage them in that way.
Yeah, I could try. What I've done so far. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. What I've done so far is we built a frame and created a bank of a mixture of sand and garden soil, and it was at about 45 degrees angle, and it was compacted. In fact, it was so hard we were beginning to wonder whether it was too hard, and nothing has happened. We haven't got any sign of anything using it. So I've tried planting some grass on it in the hope that that might help, but so far nothing has used it at all. Got any ideas? I got advice from the bumblebee conservation people, and they weren't sure how to do it, but that's more or less what they suggested, but it hasn't worked.
I'd say it's not something I've had much experience of. The only thing I could think of is that there's lots of other natural sites which the bees are actually using in preference to sort of your bee bank.
Yeah, we haven't got any north facing. All our banks are north facing, so that's why we've created it artificially, because we haven't got we're on a north facing slope, so it's actually difficult to get a bank that's south facing. That's why we've made this one. But
how long's it been there?
Nearly 2 years now.
Nearly a year.
We created it last summer.
Yeah, I think it's probably just too early yet. Just bear with it.
And what about the grass on it? Is that a good idea?
I wouldn't let the grass get too thick.
Yeah, it's fast grass.
Bare patches are good.
Okay. Yeah.
And just have patience, and if there's pollen sources around, they'll come.
Oh, there are lots of pollen sources. Yeah.
Yeah, they should do.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
Okay, great. And Elaine Wright has put in a link to a good guide to making mining bee habitat. So that's worth a check as well. Okay, we'll go on to another question from the chat, from Thomas Heathwaite. What kind of size are mining bees, and would it be possible that a number of small bees flying in the sun together could be mining bees?
At this time of year, that's quite probable. They probably sort of lots of males swarming, looking for females. So they range in size from just slightly larger than a honeybee. So you're talking about 14, 15 millimeters long, down to the really small ones, which are probably about 6 or 7 millimeters in length. They're the sort of what they call the mini miners. So there's quite a size range.
Okay, great. I'll now go to a question from the floor. So I think there was more than one hand up now, but I think I can only see one at the moment. So Chloe, do you want to say your question?
Okay, thank you. Hi, Tony.
Hiya.
I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that the female Andrena scotica has the two-tone hairs on the hind tibia, and that a number of other bees have that. Is there anything that looks like Andrena scotica that I could actually confuse that with?
Well, the obvious one that springs to mind locally is Andrena nitida does have a similar feature.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's quite distinct, isn't it? It looks different in other ways. So I'd probably be okay with that, yeah.
Yeah, but none of the other common ones have that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take a couple more raised hands. I think Jenny Wilding was next. Yeah, you're welcome to say your question, Jenny.
Oh, hi, mine wasn't a question. It was a comment about the unsuccessful artificial bee bank. If you can get a bit of soil from an established bee bank and mix that in, that might help. It's just a suggestion.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Is that going to affect that bee bank where you're taking soil from it, or?
I wouldn't suggest taking a great deal of soil, but just enough to get. I can't remember what the chemical is that the bees that sort of builds up in the soil. but there's some chemical or pheromone or something that
Okay, so it's sort of going to act as a pheromone lure to sort of make them think that the artificial bank is more is a good place to nest.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it is possible because we think that nomada bees can locate Andrena mining bees through olfactory clues. So,
right, I've not heard of that one before. Thank you. So we'll go to a question from Jan Kidd.
I was wondering, how deep do the mining bees burrow into the ground?
it varies with the different species. In some cases, I've heard might be about as deep as 40 centimeters. In others, it's a lot shallower. And I say there's sort of things like the ashy mining bee may only go down to about 10 centimeters.
Nice. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to another question from the chat now, and then I'll come back to you, Dave Bardworth, in a couple of minutes. So, question from Lucy Bolton. So, honeybees have pollen baskets, whereas solitary species do not? Question mark.
Yes. It's mainly the honeybees and bumblebees have the pollen baskets. Every other one has a sort of system where they collect the pollen on hairs in various parts of their anatomy. It just happens to be on the hind legs in Andrena species.
So I'll go to a question from the chat now from Peter Moore. What defenses do mining bees have, and do mining bees have a sting?
Female mining bees do, yes. That's about how it goes. Although it's one of those, it's not particularly a strong sting. I don't think they're very easy. They can actually sting humans from what I've read. So
okay.
Apart from that, that's about it basically.
So is that their only defense against predators as well, that that sting with the females have? Do the males have any sort of defense?
No, they have no involvement with the nest anyway, so there's probably no need for them to sort of go around stinging other insects.
As usual, the males are pretty useless.
Useless and very short-lived.
It's a short-lived, happy life.
They do.
Bit like the drones. Thank you very much.
Could I ask a follow-on from that, Gary? Could I just ask a follow-on from that?
Yeah, go on, Dave. Go on.
Talking about the sexes there, the females are the ones with the stings. It occurred to me when you was giving your talk, you were referring to some species where the males have fairly large, comparatively to others, mandibles. But then one thinks, well, the female's job is digging a burrow, and she'll need some good mandibles to remove material to get the hole made. What does the male need the mandibles for? Other than possible fighting? I mean, he's not eating, he's not chewing it, catching things to kill. So you wonder what he wants his mandibles for.
Probably the only reason I could think of is to fight off other males.
Yeah, that's what my only thought was. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sorry to come in again.
No worries.
Okay. So a question from Iona in the chat. How deep are nesting tunnels generally?
Well, I say anything, depends with species, anything up to about 40 centimeters. For some, less than.
Right, well, 40 centimeters sounds an awful lot for a small mining bee. What species do those sorts of lengths?
I think it's things like, somebody did tell me, probably sort of things like Scotica and bicolor, that sort of area. But I think clarkella might go quite that deep. But things like sort of fulva and cineraria are a lot shallower. I say some bees produce more than one tunnel, so they don't have to sort of dig so deep.
Right. Have we got any questions at the moment from the floor? Can't see any hands up, so I will go to another question from the chat. It's a question from Jane Ackerman. How can you distinguish larger mining bee burrows from anisic earthworm burrows? I'm not saying that right, am I? Oh, yeah.
I mean, the obvious sign I'd look for would be the pile of earth at the sort of entrance to the burrows, but I'm not sure what sort of.
Depends on the species, doesn't it? Because some are conical; they're a bit like
Yeah.
a small volcano. If you look at the, which depends on the species, but there'll be like a small volcano coming off the surface of the ground. Others are quite flat to the ground. There is no obvious sort of spoil from the actual tunnel. They're actually quite flat, and they like it like that, especially the mini miners. They like it extremely flat. They also have a tendency to build nests in the most precarious places, especially where people walk. They love paths that are well trodden. Seem to put themselves in danger constantly.
I know a few solitary wasps that do that.
Yeah, do that as well. But a lot of them, especially sort of the tawnies, they're like extremely short grass areas. So people who have a lovely bowling green lawn usually can get a real sort of nightmare going on, and I get a lot of sort of emails about I've got all these things appearing in me beautiful lawn. What is it? And it's usually tawnies or ashes.
Yeah, it's a regular inquiry at the museum.
Yeah,
especially this time of year.
Yeah. But I just said, you're privileged to have them. Just let them be. Keep your grass longer. You'll have more wildlife coming in.
It's good for the soil as well.
It's very good for the soil, very aerated. But also the tunnels aren't just, it ain't just sort of straight down. It's they sort of go down and then they'll bend in either a left or a right direction, depends on the species. And then there'll be multiple sort of chambers coming off that. It can be up to 30, sometimes 60 chambers coming off, depending on some of the deepest mining bees. And as Tony said, 40 centimeters is sort of the deepest some of them go, but on average, even an ashy can go to 20, sometimes 30 centimeters, depending on the loam and how deep they want to get down. And they'll line it as well. Sometimes they'll waterproof it, which is interesting, But they'll have multiple chambers coming off with all their young laid in. And they're quite amazing if you can ever cut one and you ever see one in profile. They're an amazing. This little bee builds this amazing city underground. Quite an amazing achievement from such a small animal. Yeah.
I read somewhere
Sorry, Tony.
I was going to say I read somewhere about somebody who was filling the nests with plaster of Paris.
Oh yes, yeah, you can do that. And you've got to know if it's an empty nest. You don't want to kill an active nest, but you can get a beautiful sort of model of it of what they do. But yeah, they're quite amazing. But the aggregated ones are slightly different because the females use the shared sort of space. I've even seen some of them. And as you were saying, Tony, the nomads can detect they do detect the pheromones. They do detect them by sight, and they will watch the same as certain flies who are parasitic as well. They're like the satellite fly will actually seek out and watch for certain mining bees. But the nomads will actually sight detect, or they will pheromone detect. And I've seen sort of chocolate Andrenas actually prefer to nest near, especially where horses are and where horses wee. and they seem to use the urine as a masking, and them nests seem to get less attacked than ones that are a bit further towards where the woodland is, or woodland edge and that, and there's a footpath or a farmer's field where they've decided that where the tractors have been, that's lovely and compacted. They seem to get really attacked, but where the ones seem to have chosen where the horses are, especially on an edge of a field, and the horses have really compacted it, and they like the wee there, they seem to use that as a great mask. So there's a good bit of research that could go on there.
That sounds like an ideal student project.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. But
yeah, that's really interesting.
They're incredible animals. They're just everything about them, their life cycles, everything is just, and the relationship with their parasites as well, because the parasites don't they don't want to kill their hosts, so they're very selective in how many nests they go in and how many eggs they'll lay. You can get occasional where for some reason, and it's not sort of known yet, they will actually wipe out a colony. They'll over parasitize it, but in most cases you'll see that they're very selective, and if you wait till the following year and you watch you see how many hatch out of a colony, you find it's not as many as you think it would be. It's they're actually quite in balance with their hosts, so that they get, they can keep going and their hosts keep going. So it's quite fascinating, really, what's going on.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Just going back to that original question there. I mean, just in my naivety, I would have said, earthworms is normally you'd normally see sort of a more of a lump of mud clay on mainly on one side of the hole, sometimes two sides of the hole, and it's much more together as one sort of thing. Whereas with bees, I think of it much more granular and sort of spread out around the hole more. But that's just completely in my naivety, really not very well. But
no, you're right. It's like basically the annelids are basically the worms. It's just an exclusion from their from where they're eating the soil. So it's basically it's like spaghetti wound up, if you could uncoil it. And it's sort of like wet and globular, whereas the bees aren't. The bees, it's basically like fine sugar. It's like granular sugar around a hole. But it amazes me how sometimes, even trying to find them, is where they actually take the soil. Some of these bees just literally they'll dig their nests, but they seem to take the soil away so that there's no evidence there's actually a nest there. That's quite amazing in itself.
Yeah, I see Iris has written in the chat, according to a US book on solitary bees, some species minds go down to meters, which is, well, sounds amazing.
Yeah. Tropical species, especially rainforest species, can be, there's ones recorded as deep as 5 feet. So that's I can't remember what that is in meters now. Is it 1.6? 1.5, yeah, something like that, which is amazingly deep for a small insect.
Okay, we'll go to another question now. I'll just give a quick check. Do we have any questions at this moment in time from the floor? I can't see any. Okay, I will go to another one from the chat. So this is from Anne Gascoigne. Are tunnels prone to predation by anything? Woodpeckers, wading birds, moles, hedgehogs?
Not in my experience, although I have read accounts of birds sort of taking bees leaving the nest. I mean, I have seen sort of, I think it was pied wagtails taking ashy mining bees as soon as they were leaving the nest holes, and I think other birds have been recorded doing that as well. But they're probably just opportunists. I don't think you'd get anything deliberately sort of attacking the nest.
Right. And obviously bee eaters don't turn up in this country very often, do they? But they just catch things in the air, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I only just put in, badgers. Badgers dig them up in the garden. Well, yeah. Very right. I'll go to another question then. This one from Graham. For bees which have a very relatively long flight periods of several months, how long do individual bees live? Is the longer flight period due to bees of the same generation emerging over a period of time, and so extending the period that the bee is in flight?
Yeah, I think the general life cycle of a bee, life expectancy of a bee is probably 6 to 8 weeks. So obviously you're going to get overlap of different bees emerging at different times.
Okay, we'll go to another question, and this one's from Nicholas Bellinger. Has there been any changes in bee species and or decline in colonies in the past few years?
Well, I suspect that, well, generally, we reckon that about 46% of Britain's bee species have been declining over the last few years. That's a figure I saw. But that's a few years out of date. So. But it's like most things. Some are doing well and some are doing better than others, and some are doing aren't doing so well.
And at what sort of rate are bees arriving into this country through the warming climate? Are we getting them every year? Or?
We're getting odd ones every year. Most of the ones that seem to be turning up are new species of Nomada, from what I could see. Looking at sort of George Elsie's book. I've not heard of any new Andrena species being added to the British list for a while. Although that might change when people start looking at the molecular side of things.
Yeah. Yes. Any questions? Anyone with their hands up?
Just a quick one, please.
Okay, Dave.
You mentioned the Nomada bees there as being potentially new ones. I'd have thought the Nomada would be associated with one or two hosts and would be just delayed on the arrival of a new species. One question is, why is it a Nomada bee that's now new to an existing host? Why is it only just been there rather than it been there forever before? As an ectoparasite, as a kleptoparasite.
Well, I just wonder if these have just been brought in accidentally.
So you think that they're possibly feeding or they're parasitizing the same host in Europe, say, not been in this country, but then they arrive by accident.
Yeah.
They find the host there. But really, I mean, I can understand that. But my thinking is, why weren't they associated with that host right from day one? If they're associated in Europe, I'm saying Europe, wherever, you'd think they'd be associated in evolutionary time with the same species here in the UK.
Well, perhaps they're only able to exploit a particular host if it's in particularly within certain environmental conditions.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we'll go to a question from the chat from Kate. Brilliant, thank you. Just wondering how likely we are to be able to pick up these ones we have learned out from the other 20 or so in the field. Are there many that are similar?
There are, but sort of with a bit of practice, you should be able to sort of get to know the commonest species after a while. It depends which part of the country you're living in as well, because no, these are the ones I've discussed, the ones which are in our area. Obviously, if you're living in the south of England, you've got a lot more species to choose from. Whereas in the north of Scotland, it's just the opposite.
And I would say it's always a really good idea to get very familiar with the really common species, because then you start to notice the subtle differences or something in the way the sort of the jizz of something, and you can see then spot the ones that aren't that are different. Okay, we'll go to another question. This one from Richard. How do bees avoid inbreeding?
It's an interesting one. It's not something I've ever come across in any of the literature, to be honest. So.
Okay. Is there anyone else who would like to comment on that one? Probably not that well studied subject area. I don't know.
Gary, I think that the issue will be the sheer number of bees, males and females. They might appear to be in a dense aggregation, you know, a large amount that will have come from the previous generation, but I'm sure that just on sheer numbers, the genetic statistics work so that you don't get an inbreeding problem.
And you do usually find males quite away from some of the aggregations as well. I've been in places where there've been what I thought were quite tight aggregations, and I've moved a mile away to look for something else, and there's a male heading away from that aggregation. So I think they do disperse as well. Probably the females do as well, but certainly the males do, to look for new females.
Well, yeah, that sounds like a strategy that's going to certainly stop that happening too much. So, yeah, okay. We'll go on to another question then. There's a question from Zoe. We're friends of Havov. I'm probably saying that wrong. Sorry, Zoe. You said that in the species which have 2 generations a year, the second generation can differ from the first. In what ways? Great talk, by the way.
Basically, you just look different. There might be sort of subtle differences in hair color or sort of size or various other features.
Is there any examples of a common one that looks different in a second generation, Tony?
Yes, I'm trying to think that the obvious one is.
Someone's just saying there on the chat, Andrena trimerana looks very different. Is it trimerana?
Oh, Chloe,
probably,
yes.
Yeah. It's not the one that we get round here, so it's not what I'm familiar with.
Chloe, did you want to describe that difference?
I've only seen the either the spring or the summer one, but this is one where it has a really long spine on the kind of bit of face just before the mandible in the spring generation, I think, and then it doesn't have it in the summer generation. So it's really quite a, you know, an identifying feature which can be really different. I just saw one when I was down in Suffolk a few years ago. So obviously I haven't seen both generations, but when I keyed it out, I noted that, you know, it can be really different.
Yes, the common mini minor, the males on that have got different sort of facial hairs depending on which generation they're from.
Of course, it's not uncommon in Lepidoptera. Is it holly blue have a different look?
And speckled woods.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go on to another question. Thanks everyone for contributions. So this one from Rachel Toon. How closely related are mining bees to honeybees?
Not very, I suspect.
I presume honeybees, they're all in the same family, Apidae, aren't they? They're all
Yeah.
in the same.
Well, actually, Andrenidae, so they are a completely different family.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
they probably had a common ancestor a long, long time ago, but
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Honeybees are more related to bumblebees. They're in the Apis group, but they're extremely advanced bees because they're so social. And they overwinter as a social group, so they're extremely advanced. Where the bumblebees are eusocial, eurosocial, so they're not as advanced, but the honeybee went that next step, and it's extremely social animal. Honeybees are a whole talk in themselves. And in fact, they're a nightmare for wild bees, because they're so now basically hybridized into a non-wild species, that their effect on wild bees is quite enormous. Yeah, so well, that's from a conservation point of view, you don't want honeybees anywhere near where wild bees are. They literally will take every bit of nectar and pollen that's within an area and leave nothing for anything else. So yes, but it's quite a controversial thing between honeykeepers and wild bee enthusiasts. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So Rachel, they're in different families.
Yes,
basically.
But the way to view it is the fact that the bees came from wasps, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, they came from sawflies, didn't they? So sawflies were your beginning.
Honey, and then the rest of the bees. It's the other way.
Yeah. And you got to remember that bees were originally carnivorous. They just, for some reason, started to find a taste for eating pollen, and then the pollen became, and then they got a liking for nectar, and then they started to go down that line. But originally, all sort of bees were extremely carnivorous. They were hunters like wasps, and then the wasps family split off, keeping that sort of carnivorous sort of way, and then their adaptations took place. But they all began as, in the Hymenoptera, they all began as sawflies. So, and that's what the stinger is that adaptation of that original tool that the sawflies have at the end of their abdomen, but just became more and more modified as it went along.
So great knowledge, Steve.
And that does explain, of course, a further question why the males have good sized mandibles that they're not really using, because evolutionary, as you're saying, there were predators previous to that, and they've not actually lost the mandibles for any reason.
It could be. Some of them also use it for some of these little males. If you do watch them in a mating situation, apart from fighting, some of these males will actually attach themselves and grab hold of a female with their mandibles.
Right.
So they'll hold on to her and say, "No, she's mine." She's, I'm mating with her. No, no one else is getting near.
Another hypothesis would be that some of the smaller bees that appear to have disproportionately large mandibles, it could be suggested that it's one of these, it confers protection. So the small bees with the small mandibles got taken out by a predator. The genes of the small bees with big mandibles, the predators may well have left them. I think these things are never provable 100%, but it's a hypothesis that's out there. A bit like stag beetles. They're not for biting, they're for wrestling, but here it's for warding something off.
Okay, great stuff. Yeah, interesting perspectives and theories. Okay, to a question from David Robinson. Pheromones. Do all mining bees respond to the same pheromones, or do they all have their individual pheromones? Sort of blend of pheromone.
I suspect it's most likely they each have their individual pheromones, but they're just perhaps just subtly different chemically.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think why they wouldn't be pretty unique. Otherwise, it's going to be quite a disadvantage to be attracted to an aggregation of the wrong species, isn't it? When you have these Lepidopteran lures that are made synthetically, that they normally only attract one one type of moth, or yeah, I don't know if anyone would like to add to that, but probably unique, I would think. Okay, we'll go on to the next question. This one from Geraldine. I live near Lyme Park and seem to have very few insects, including bees, around at the moment. Is this normal?
Well, there's not any insects in our garden at the moment, so I would say yes, especially in this part of the world. And obviously in Lyme Park, it's slightly higher up than sort of most of lowland Cheshire, so things are probably a bit slower down there as well.
Okay, so just hang on there, Geraldine, and keep looking. Hopefully the season will progress probably quite quickly now, I would think, yeah, as we get into late March and April. Okay, a question from Joanna Holm. I live in an area of clay soils. Am I likely to see any in the garden, any mining bees in the garden?
Well, if you've got sort of flowers which they're coming to visit to feed on, then yes, but whether or not they'll nest in your sort of that particular type of soil will really depend on what species you have locally, because there are one or two which will happily nest in clay soils, but the majority they're looking for sort of lighter sandy sort of substrate.
So something like an Andrena fulva, Tony, is that going to come in a clay soil garden?
No, it won't. Well, it'll visit the garden, and it probably will sort of nest if that's the only sort of soil it has. But I say the easiest thing to get these in your garden is plant the right food plants for them.
Okay. Has anyone got any questions from the floor at the moment? No? Okay. Oh, I think we are on to the last question that I've got here. This one from Lucy Bolton. Do any of you have any advice for an undergraduate just starting a bee-orientated career?
See if there's a local bee group in the area or somebody who's actually going out recording regularly that you can tag along with.
Yeah, I don't know what undergraduate degree you're doing, Lucy, but it's likely that your course isn't going to be doing much on identification skills and biological recording, because it's sort of missing from the syllabus of many courses. But yeah, we don't know where you are. Perhaps there might even be people in this room who are in groups around the country that would welcome you would attend them, and they've probably got helpful mentors and that might be able to support your learning. But
yeah, I mean, I don't know what it's like in other areas, but here in Hertfordshire, because I'm the county recorder for Hertfordshire for Hymenoptera, and I have students and lots of people come when I'm doing field surveys and things. So they come out and we go through different how to do field ID and things like that, and I get help from them, and actually they've become a very useful network on giving me information of different parts of Hertfordshire of different things turning up, especially the large carpenter bee that's now appearing from Europe. That seems to be all over Hertfordshire now. It seems to come it's nesting everywhere. So, but yeah, maybe the same. But I would advise contacting your local Natural History Society. The Hertfordshire Natural History Society, we're extremely proactive, and we like to, get people involved. Unfortunately, the pandemic's been a complete nightmare. It shut everything down, and as with Mark Taylor, Ben's, we used to do a lot of ID workshops and that, and they will come back for people to get, and especially for students to get involved with. But unfortunately, at the moment, till the pandemic's sorted. It's just a bit of a problem. But there is
Checks in the
people.
post, Steve.
Sorry?
The checks in the post.
Yes.
I would also suggest that you can get actively involved on the Bee Awards Facebook site at the moment as well.
Yeah.
And the amount of help you'll elicit. I mean, Steve and I both had training roles in Brit Entsoc and Dipteris Forum, things like that. And we give generously, and we just really enjoy people joining in on the forums.
Yeah.
I think it'd be prudent to say also, just in case there's anybody who wants to get involved and hasn't sort of seen how they work. If you're going to send in pictures, where and when, minimum, because it will affect what we can tell you about what we're seeing. And also try and grab as many pictures as you can, top, bottom, sides, you name it, face on, rump on. And if we can't give you a decision, then we'll point you in the right direction of how you could have taken a slightly different picture. If there are any text that we can supply you as PDFs, not all keys are free, but there are a number out there. So we will do our best, if you engage with us, to support you wholeheartedly.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's brilliant to know of that great support out there.
Yeah, I'd also say, get in contact with your local museum if you've got one nearby. Yeah, it's like the World Museum is just great for getting involved with meeting people who are doing what you want to do as well. And also, there's probably maybe some bee research going on at your university. See what's going on there as well, and try and get involved with that. And also charities like Bumblebee Conservation Trust and Bug Life, they do a lot of training which you could get involved with, and the FSC centres provide a lot of training normally. There's so much you can volunteer with, and get lots of experience from lots of experienced people.
Thank you, Leanna. I guess Lucy might have gone now, actually. She looks like she said she was needing to go. Of course, Lucy might have wanted just to be a professional beekeeper, and maybe that's a different path to go down in terms of training and things, but there must be a lot of people out there doing that. So any more questions? There doesn't seem to be any more in the chat. Oh, there we are. Rod, known as Mary Dean.
Yeah, no. Yeah, Mary's been on here and she's messed it up for me. Going back to evolution and the mandibles for the males, would it be sensible for the males to keep their mandibles to maintain their options for evolution and speed of adaptation to environmental stimuli?
It's an interesting hypothesis, that one, because you've got two different types of evolution. Broadly speaking, haven't you? You've got the quirky genetic mutation that confers some beneficial outcome later on. So here you could say that the peppered moth in the Industrial Revolution, a few of them mutated to become overly dark and survived.
Yeah.
And then there are others where it was just a natural variation in colour, but then when you ended up with the yellow and orange stripes and you fed on ragwort, you were just bloody horrible to eat. So the time scale to confer that protection based on the change of environment, I think the two time scales are misaligned there, but it's worth considering, and that's the thing, keeping an open mind to all these things, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, once the mandibles are gone, you're going down a tunnel and limiting your options, aren't you?
Mm.
Yes, it's a fascinating topic, and it's been great. Every webinar we seem to have getting more and more sort of interesting discussions going at the end of them, which is brilliant.
And could I just say before everybody leaves, I don't know if everybody is aware or they are quite up to speed, but I'd like to just put out a plea, if everybody in this webinar that's taking part, because you're all interested in bees, we have a situation going on at Swanscombe Peninsula, which Bug Life and RSPB and everybody else are trying to. They've got a petition up. If you go online and just look for Swanscombe Peninsula, we need as many people to sign it, because it's now gone to the Secretary of State to build on a brownfield site, which is probably the most urban rainforest site in the whole of Britain for the amount of biodiversity that's on it. Natural England have just declared it a triple SI site, and they're wanting to build a theme park on it. And this has been going on now for around about since 2012. So it's been in the pipeline a long time, and we've been campaigning and we've won battles, but now the Secretary of State's got involved, and there's a possibility he could give permission to just basically wipe out this unique area that has the distinguished jumping spider there, which is only known in two sites. Swanscombe and just across the River Thames on the Essex side on another small area, and it is critically endangered across Europe as well. So if they do build it, it's the end of quite a number of bee species, from the brown-banded carder, shrill carder, there's the sea aster, mining bees are there. It is literally, there's over 2,000 species of invertebrate there that need protecting. So if everyone could sign the petition, or everyone could tell everybody to sign the petition, or just whatever you can do, the more help, the better, please.
Thank you, Steve. Where is Swanscombe?
Swanscombe is on the Thames estuary. It's a peninsula on the Thames estuary, and it's literally extremely threatened by this development. It's a unique habitat. It's a brownfield site that over 60 years became derelict. In the 1960s, it started to become derelict. And in the 60 years that have passed, in the intervening years, it has now become one of the richest invertebrate sites in the whole of Britain. It is absolutely unique for the biodiversity that is there. And the bird species, reptiles, amphibians, everything is there. And the proposed development will literally just concrete it and wipe it out. They talk about sustainability and that they're going to enhance the environment. Well, you can't enhance it. It's perfect. It just doesn't need enhancing. It just needs leaving alone. So, yeah. But Swanscombe Peninsula, it's called, and Bug Life have got a huge campaign going at the moment, if you look online.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Yeah, as I say, it's been another really interesting webinar, not only for Tony's excellent introduction, but also really good discussion as well at the end there. But yeah, hopefully we'll get some sunny weather soon. Well, at least in the northwest anyway, that we don't seem to have today. And we'll have lots of Andrena mining bees flying about, and lots of recording can start to take place by all of you. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of the afternoon. We'll hopefully see you again soon. There's plenty more webinars coming up.